So, good day everyone. Hi, Ma'am Elenita. I'm Merlin Bukoy from BSED English 2B. And for today's video, we will discuss the following terms. To start with the word, what is genre? Genre is a particular type of literature, paintings, music, films, or other form which people consider as a class because it has a special characteristics. And some of the most common genres of literature for kids include picture books, traditional literature, poetry and prose, biography, fiction, and non-fiction. Picture books. Picture books are usually written for very young children who are learning to read. These books include thickly constructed board books for very young children. Concept books such as those that teach the alphabet, counting, or basic reading skills. And simple, illustrated books that are read to children to expose them to the language and the art of reading. Next is examples of traditional children's literature in this genre of picture books might include The Cat in the Hat, Green Eggs and Ham, or other stories by Dr. Seuss. So second is the traditional literature for children varies widely and it's perhaps the most loosely defined genre because selections might overlap in the general fiction category. Some educators believe that traditional children's literature is strictly characterized by unknown authorship, stereotypical characters, anthropomorphism, and a happy ending. Books that fall into this category might include the folk tales, fables, and fairy tales such as Aesop fables, the Grimm brothers fairy tales. So third is the poetry and verse. Literature includes the epic poem, narrative poem, dramatic poem, lyric, and sonnet, among others. Rhyming literature is popular with very young children, as seen in the cherished nursery rhyme and fables favorites Mother Goose, Jack and Jill, and Little Miss Muffet. So next, the fourth is the biographies or autobiographies. For children are usually meant to inspire young people or educate them while providing entertainment. So next, the fiction and non-fiction comprise the widest variety of literature for children. Modern fantasy and science fiction stories have become extremely popular with children. Generally, modern fantasy is characterized by time travel, imaginary characters, and animals or inanimate objects that talk. Nonfiction literature for children is informational in nature, either as instruction, explanation, or persuasion. Literature for children in this genre includes the children's almanac, science books, or classic reference books geared toward children. So next, what is fantasy? A fantasy is a pleasant situation or event that you think about and that you want to happen, especially one that is unlikely to happen. So the difference between the high and low fantasy is these are the two main categories of fantasy. The high fantasy refers to epic fantasy which is set in an alternate world. It typically includes lots of magical elements, fantastical creatures, and unusual technology. Whereas the low fantasy is when magical creatures and elements intrude upon the regular world. So now let's discuss the types of fantasy stories. To begin with the dark fantasy. Dark fantasy is known for its unsettling themes and unexpected grim turns usually targeted at adults or at least the upper years of young adults. Stephen King is perhaps the best known writer of this type of fantasy, but many others are creating a name for themselves, including the likes of Joe Abercrombie and R.F. Kuang. So second is the superhero fantasy is very much confined to comic books and comic book movies. This type of fantasy is all about taking the superhero concept and intertwining it with how they acquire their powers. In many of your favorite series, you'll find that sci-fi notions are often the prevailing reason behind their superpowers. But sometimes fantasy comes into play. So next is the fairy tales and folklore. Fairy tales, legends, myths, these are all the examples of early types of fantasy. From fireside tales of spirits and goblins, stealing away children to legendary mazes, home to minotaurs and winged horses that fly into battle. All these sorts of mythic stories fall under this particular subgenre of fantasy. So next is the low fantasy. This type of fantasy is effectively the polar opposite of the epic. Instead of being set in its own world with no connection to reality, low fantasy is very realistic and houses only a few elements of the fantasy genre. A strong and well-known example of low fantasy is the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So next is the urban fantasy. Urban fantasy is commonly found intertwined with dark fantasy, but it doesn't have to be. What really sets this type of fantasy apart is its location. Urban fantasy is quite literally urban, set within cities or towns, and following close-knit stories related to the local urban landscape in at least some form. Famous examples of this urban fantasy include the Neverwhere and City of Bones. Next is the contemporary fantasy is set in the present day, or at least it was at the time it was written. Stories like American Gods, Percy Jackson, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and even Stranger Things are all what you'd consider contemporary fantasy. It's just a fantasy tale taking place in the modern era. So next is the paranormal fantasy. As you might guess, this type of fantasy is all about your ghost stories, your demons, and what have you. The concept of sixth senses and possession. As a subgenre, it is a quite vague and rarely sits alone. You'll often find paranormal fantasy mixed with other types of fantasy, most notably dark, urban, and fairy tale. So next is the historic fantasy, engages in fantasy notions yet is set around a specific period in history that actually took place, often bringing new elements to it. It essentially portrays an alternate versions of history. J.K. Rowling's New Fantastic Beasts movie series is an example of this type of fantasy. So next is the medieval fantasy. Not to be confused with historic fantasy, medieval fantasy is set during the dark ages of world history and covers a lot of this word and sorcery type of fantasy. This is also not to be confused with high fantasy that is set in a medieval-like world. Medieval fantasy is a type of fantasy that is set on Earth, but just not during a defined period. So next is the science fantasy. The best example of this type of fantasy is always going to be the Star Wars. But others under the science fantasy subgenre include the Avatar and Jurassic Park. The basis of science fantasy is that it takes fantasy elements and presents them as a science. Now, what is science fiction? It's a genre of fiction in which the stories often tell about science and technology of the future. It is important to note that science fiction has a relationship with the principles of science, or the stories involve partially true, partially fictitious laws or theories of science. So next is the historical fiction. It is set in a real place during a culturally recognizable time. The details and the action in the story can be a mix of actual events and ones from the author's imagination as they fill in the gaps. Characters can be pure fiction or based on real people, or often it's both. So next is the realistic fiction. It creates imaginary characters and situations that depict our world and society. It focuses on themes of growing up and confronting personal and social problems. So this genre portrays characters coming to understand themselves and others. So now let's discuss the types of realistic fiction, to start with the family stories or domestic stories. So family stories frequently rely on episodic plots since they are built around the daily details and activities. The squabblings, the schemings, or in the reconciliations in which families are normally engaged. So next, another type of this realistic is the animal stories. This type of stories hinge on the premise that animals' characters share certain human traits, the capacity for love, loyalty, jealousy, fear, and etc. So next is the sports stories. Promote high moral character and good sportsmanship. They are usually coming of age stories, particularly when the protagonist gains self-knowledge through participation in sports. Next is the historical stories. They are the popular because of their subject matter. Although too often the plots are predictable, the characters are stereotyped and the dialogue is trite. So next is the stories of social realism. These type of stories deal with friendship, self-identity, racial prejudice, child abuse, alcoholism, drug addiction, and other social issues that may involve in human growth and development. Next is the adventure and survival stories. So these adventure stories, often romantic, have long been popular with children. Many adventure stories are, in fact, survival stories which depict individuals pitted against the forces of nature, or in many modern works, the forces of a cruel, insensitive society. They are usually coming of age stories depicting individuals rising above adversity, facing forces that are greater and more formidable than they are, and discovering themselves. So next is the mystery or detective story as a form of romance, escapist fiction, creating a world more exciting, more dangerous, and more beautiful than we imagine our own to be. The mystery first popularized in the early 19th century by Edgar Allan Poe. The phrase picture book is commonly used to describe a book, most often written for children, in which the content is conveyed through the use of words and pictures in combination or two pictures alone. The African American stories, like the Dave the Potter, Artist Poet, Slave, is a picture book written in verse about an African American slave who lived in the 180s in South Carolina. Dave created pottery and then wrote a short poem on them. This seems unimpressive at first, but Dave did this during a period in our country's history when it was illegal for slaves to learn to read or write. The punishment is the 50 lashes. Now, multicultural literature includes books that portray people of color. This includes the African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos. They also, however, include books that help to portray religious groups other than the Christians, like Jews, Catholics, Muslim, Mormons, and Amish. The Native American Stories. 13 Moons on Turtleback by Joseph Bruchac and Jonathan London is a picture book with a collection of poems. The poems explains the Native American lunar calendar that includes the 13 moons. So next is the Asian American Stories. So, A Single Short by Linda Shu Park is a historical novel about a small seaside village in the west coast of Korea, where Celadon pottery has been made since 1980 AD. The novel is also about accepting life's adversities and becoming triumphant in spite of them. Rainman, a homeless village cripple, takes charge of an unwanted, abandoned orphan 3-year. The Latinos or the Latina stories. Esperanza Rising by Pam Munoz Ryan is a novel about a wealthy Mexican landowner's only daughter, Esperanza Ortega. The story starts out weeks before her 13th birthday. As Esperanza lives a pampered, sheltered life, she goes to a private all-girls school. She has a servant that still helps her bath, and she has never had to work a single day of her young life. Things change when suddenly, when the day before her birthday, her father is robbed and killed by bandits. The following are the samples of children's poetry books. First is The Songbird Dreams of Singing by Kate Hosford and Jennifer M. Potter, 2019. Second, The Kings and Queens by Eleanor and Herbert Farjan, 1932. Revolting Rhymes by Roald Dahl, 1982. Funky Chickens by Benjamin Zepania, 1996. Gargling with Jelly by Brian Patton, 1985. Poetry Jump Up compiled by Grace Nichols, 1990. Michael Rosen's Book of Very Silly Poems by Michael Rosen, 1996. Silly Verse for Kids by Spike Milligan, 1959. Let's define fable. Fable is a narrative form usually featuring animals that behave and speak as human beings told in order to highlight human follies and weaknesses. Next is the myth. Myth is a well-known story which was made up in the past to explain natural events or to justify religious beliefs or social customs. Next is the legend. Legend is a non-historical or unverifiable story handed down by tradition from earlier times and popularly accepted as historical. The tall tales are the stories with outrageous elements that are difficult to believe, although the elements of tall tales are related as if they were factual. The reader knows they are exaggerated and are meant to simply be form of entertainment. So next, the realistic fiction or tales. It is a story written about events that did not actually happen but could have happened. The people, events, and places may be real. Next is the trickster tales. It is a books. These are the posters and the suggested activities prescribed in the guide are designed to help children develop their visual and verbal skills as they look at, study to think about, and reflect on the illustrations. So lastly is the Tales of Mother Goose. It is a collection of fairy tales written by Charles Perrault, 1628 to 1703, and published first in France in 1697. The figure of Mother Goose is an imaginary author of a collection of fairy tales and nursery rhymes, often published as Mother Goose Rhymes. As a character, she only appears in one nursery rhyme. Mother Goose is generally depicted in illustration as an elderly country woman in a tall hat and shawl, a costume identical to the peasant costume worn in Wales in the early 20th century. But she is also sometimes depicted as a goose, usually wearing a bonnet. She is credited with the Mother Goose stories and rhymes popularized in the 1700s in English language literature, although no specific writers have ever been identified with such a name.